Well, Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, last week, former Daily Show host Jon Stewart interviewed a bipartisan panel of former State Department heads, which proved that when it comes to foreign policy, there is no red, no blue, just American empire. Now, it's a 44-minute interview with plenty to provoke if you're looking for fodder for these tense Thanksgiving dinner conversations. But one excerpted clip in particular has been making the rounds, and I think it's because it's such a perfect exemplification of what's wrong with our foreign policy apparatus. In it, Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice are completely take for granted the U.S.'s role as, quote, the world policeman. When questioned about the wisdom of intervention in Libya, which even Obama describes as his worst mistake, Hillary declined to consider even for a moment whether intervention was the best course of action. Instead, she justified the NATO intervention, which involved over 7,000 bombing missions and which has led to the rise of literal slave markets in Libya, on the basis that then leader Muammar Gaddafi threatened to kill his own people like cockroaches. Here's the first part of the clip.
Just very briefly on Libya, because that was on my watch.
But this is not, again.
No, but I want to make a larger point because, Gaddafi was a bad actor. Everybody knew he was a bad actor, and he threatened to kill his people by cockroaches. The United States was actually the supporter of European countries through NATO and the Arab League, which for the very first time came and said, we want to be part of trying to protect the people of Libya. Now, so I feel that particular intervention, we had certain capabilities militarily that nobody else had, which we used to assist them. But, the Emiratis were flying and the Jordanians were flying, et cetera. The problem, and this is where I think you make a really good point. The problem is, okay, Gaddafi's gone. Mm-hmm. His horrible prisons are emptied. What comes next?
Right.
What comes next?
And that's always a problem because there's always a vacuum. Because, look, dictators don't allow institutions to flourish. So when you take the dictator out, there are no institutions.
That's right.
So but the question becomes, do you then say, let Gaddafi go ahead and kill his people because it's going to be hard afterwards? Or in our case, we thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Are you going to let that continue, or are you going to take him out? And then do the best that you can in helping people to recover. You have to recognize that it's going to be hard once you take the dictator out.
Holy smokes. Who would have thought you need to define the goals of your intervention and consider what happens in the void once you topple a regime? Apparently not two former secretaries of state. And looking at the U.S. involvement in Ukraine, I'm afraid this is a lesson that America still hasn't learned. Now, for context, at the beginning of this clip, Clinton is referring to a speech Gaddafi made to supporters about protests about protesters calling for his resignation, in which he told his supporters to attack the, quote, cockroaches, greasy rats, and cats protesting against him. Now, one doesn't need to approve of that language or the incitement to violence to admit that the standard for dropping bombs on a sovereign nation is certainly higher than mere despotic language. After all, the U.S. loves to back dictators when those dictators back the global capital order. It's why Biden has kowtowed to Saudi Arabia's MBS, despite saying he'd make him a pariah, and why Trump joked, "Who's my favorite dictator?" during a 2019 summit attended by Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Johns Hopkins professor Robert Gutman hits the nail on the head when he attributes America's inconsistency on the matter of dictators to cynical self-interest. Moreover, if dehumanizing language that incited militias to violence were a cause for humanitarian intervention, the U.S. could be ripe for invasion. I'm old enough to remember during the 2016 Democratic primary, Hillary Clinton was dogged by statements she had made in the past about Black and brown children, describing them as super predators that had to be, quote, brought to heel. Language that is deeply dehumanizing and which came in tandem with tough on crime policies that incarcerated and killed a generation of Americans. What her remarks didn't do, well, invite an international humanitarian intervention on behalf of the U.S. prison population, the largest prison population in the world, according to data from 2015. Of course, one of the biggest criticisms of NATO's Libyan intervention was that it selectively took elements of Gaddafi's rhetoric at face value. That's a quote from the United Kingdom's parliamentary investigation into the aftermath of the war, which concluded that the government failed to identify that the threat to civilians was overstated and that the rebels NATO was backing included a significant Islamist extremist element. The report concluded that Gaddafi was not, in fact, planning to massacre civilians, and that reports of his plans to do so were propaganda spread by Western governments and the rebels themselves. But America did what Gaddafi did not. The New York Times investigation found credible accounts of dozens of civilians killed by NATO. We saw the same type of propaganda used to justify the first Gulf War, as tales of incubator babies being killed filled headlines. And lo and behold, the specter of weapons of mass destruction is still being leveraged to avoid accountability for U.S. interventionism. Just take a listen.
Should the United States be selective in the use of its military power?
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
After Afghanistan and Iraq, which we did for security reasons, not because we wanted to spread democracy at gunpoint, but for security reasons.
Although ultimately we were told that spreading democracy would make the world safer because freer countries would
I think if
be
you
more
if you
peaceful.
actually look at the record, democratic countries actually don't invade their neighbors. Democratic countries don't harbor terrorists. Democratic countries don't use weapons of mass destruction. So I think
They don't harbor them, but they have them. You can't. It'd be hard to.
But
was
John,
planned in
But
Germany.
they're not aided and
They're not
supported by
aiding
the
I understand what
government.
you're saying. I understand what you're saying.
And the always
That
try to-
is a distinction.
But
That clip now reads a little bit like a Thanksgiving dinner conversation. Look, at first I have to take on the idea that Iraq and Afghanistan were motivated by security interests rather than spreading democracy. Stewart did well to push back here, but I'd argue not quite strongly enough. Spreading democracy, of course, was an explicit justification for these wars. In a 2005 news conference, for instance, Bush alluded to a broader strategic objective, which is the establishment of democracy. In a 2003 speech, Bush explained that America's, quote, commitment to democracy is tested in the Middle East. He went on to say, quote, securing democracy in Iraq is the work of many hands. American and coalition forces are sacrificing for the peace of Iraq and for the security of free nations. Spreading democracy was a feature, not a bug of those invasions, and pretending otherwise is some of the boldest revisionist history I've ever seen. But Rice's next claim, that democratic countries don't invade their neighbors, harbor terrorists, or use weapons of mass destruction, really takes the cake. America provides military assistance to 73% of the world's dictatorships, including Saudi Arabia, whose intervention in Yemen has caused civilian deaths, illegal killings, torture, gender-based violence, and famine. Only one country has ever dropped an atomic bomb, of course. That's us. Moreover, even in relative peacetime, the U.S. drops an average of 46 bombs a day. Laos has the distinction of being the most heavily bombed nation in the world because of the 260 million bombs America dropped on it in the name of spreading democracy. Yet Condoleezza Rice has the audacity to claim that America's military power is a global force of justice and good. How much longer are Americans going to let the bipartisan blob weaponize legitimate humanitarian crises to create more humanitarian crises? How much longer will they lie about war crimes to justify war? How long will journalists, pro-peace politicians, and the voting public let them? So, Robbie, this was a pretty galling interview. It did the rounds. You know, a lot of leftists have been talking about it. I mean, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I thought it was, I agree with you very substantially in what you were saying. And Jon Stewart was a pretty well-informed and pretty on-point critic of the Iraq War throughout the aughts in the Daily Show, which was, that was must-watch viewing for everyone who had grown to be very not on board with what was going on. So it was interesting to see him. I just threw my pencil. You're missing. You're not in the studio. I couldn't. You're not going to get friendly fire here. I was surprised that he didn't push back more, given that was his history, especially with regard to that conflict. It was absolutely justified on grounds of spreading democracy. She's just not telling the truth there, Condoleezza Rice, or she's rewritten it in her own head. Absolutely, there's no question it was justified, spreading democracy. George Bush justified it that way. I'm sure Hillary Clinton did as well. So the idea that, neither of these justifications end up working because it was a very foolish effort in either case. But they want to say it was just about our own security or something. That's not at all what they said.
Well, in fact, polls about the excuse of spreading democracy, it used to be useful. It used to work and it used to be popular, but in fact, it is the Iraq and Afghanistan wars that taught Americans not to buy into that justification anymore. And now, spreading democracy polls very poorly as a consequence of what Americans learned about those conflicts. So yeah, that was pretty egregious. And this, we had a little bit of this conversation yesterday about to what extent is it whataboutism to talk about America's own misdoings versus not. And I think a conversation like this is why I think it's useful always to put these things in context. And I don't think it's necessarily whataboutism, because you have people not just saying there's a tragedy over there, we have to intervene. They're saying bold, broad statements like democracies don't do anything wrong. Democracies don't have weapons of mass destruction. Democracies don't inflict these kinds of harms on the world, as though we don't support the overwhelming majority of dictatorships that are also characterized conveniently as democracies if we want. And like this all is in some semantic game that's justifying American, the global economic interests of our country. And at least if they just said it plainly, we're going to invade because we want oil. We're going to invade because we're threatened by a different economic system that would threaten the dollar's hegemony. I wouldn't agree with it, but there's something particularly perverse about trying to use people who are really struggling around the world to justify these imperial aims.
Right. And Libya is such a good example as well. I think often a forgotten example, perhaps the clearest example of just utterly makes no sense. We wanted to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. We caused a humanitarian catastrophe.
Right.
We made that country vulnerable to ISIS's rise, which did not contribute to our own safety. People were being, executed by extremists in the streets after that government was toppled due to our intervention. Hillary Clinton masterminded it. It was the worst mistake of Barack Obama's entire presidency. I think he feels that way about it too. And then we almost elected the woman who was almost solely responsible for that. It's just incredible. And then she gets to, have an interview and lecture us all about what a smart foreign policy would look like. It just makes absolutely no sense at all. Yep. We'll have more Rising after this. Thank you for that, Briahna. Stay with us.